routine appointment that Tuesday morning, nothing dramatic, just a follow-up with my cardiologist over in Naperville. I'd been managing a mild arrhythmia for about 2 years. Nothing that stopped me from living my life, but enough that doctored me from living my life. But enough that Dr. Okafor wanted to see me every few months to check the numbers. I remember thinking, as I pulled out of my driveway, that the oak tree in the front yard needed trimming before winter. That's what was on my mind, not my heart. Not my son, just that oak tree, and whether I should call someone this week or wait until spring. I never made it to the appointment. A pickup truck ran a red light at the intersection of Route 59 and Jefferson, and it caught my front left quarter panel at about 40 miles an hour. The airbag deployed. I remember the sound, this enormous flat crack, and then white, and then nothing. I woke up in the ICU at Edward Elmhurst Hospital. My name is Raymond Kowalski. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for DuPage County before I retired, and in all that time, I had never once been admitted to a hospital. Not for anything. I used to joke that my body was as stubborn as I was. The nurse who was there when I opened my eyes was a young woman named Patricia. She had kind eyes and she spoke slowly, the way people do when they're not sure how much you understood. She told me I had a fractured left clavicle, 3 cracked ribs on my left side, and a moderate concussion. The other driver was uninjured. His truck had barely a scratch. Is there someone we should call? She asked me. I told her to call my son. His name is Gregory. He's 38, lives about 20 minutes from the hospital in Wheaton. He works in commercial real estate, has for the past 10 years, since he left his first job out of college and decided he wanted to make real money, as he put it. Patricia came back about 40 minutes later. She said she'd reached him, that he knew where I was and what had happened, and that he said he'd try to come by. I stared at the ceiling and told myself that was fine. He was probably in the middle of something. Gregory always had something going on. A deal closing, a client dinner, a conference call that couldn't be rescheduled. I'd spent the better part of his adult life understanding that his schedule was not like other people's schedules. I'd made peace with that. Or at least I'd told myself I had. He didn't come that night. By the next morning, the ribs were making themselves known every time I tried to take a full breath, and the clavicle had me in a sling that felt like it was squeezing my shoulder into a smaller shape than nature intended. Patricia was back on shift. She checked my chart, adjusted something in my IV line, and asked if my family had arrived. I said my son had been tied up. She nodded in a way that didn't quite believe me, and then she moved on to the next room. Gregory came on day 2. Midday. He was in a suit which told me he'd come on his lunch break or between appointments, and he had that look he gets. The one where his eyes are moving even when his head is still, cataloging things, running calculations. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me like he was doing an inspection. "You look rough," he said. "Thanks," I said. "Cracked ribs will do that." He asked the basic questions. What did the doctors say? How long was I staying? Was the other driver insured? He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't ask if I was scared when I woke up alone in the ICU, or if the pain was manageable, or if there was anything he could do. He asked about insurance, about the car, about whether I had legal representation yet. I told him I'd only been conscious for about 36 hours and hadn't quite gotten to the legal representation part. He nodded, checked something on his phone, and then said something I have turned over in my mind almost every day since. He said, "Dad, you really need to think about whether it still makes sense for you to be living alone in that house. This is exactly the kind of thing I've been worried about." I looked at him. "You're not getting any younger," he said, and I could hear that he'd rehearsed this, that this wasn't a spontaneous thought born from worry, but something he'd been waiting to say. "That house is too big for one person. You'd be better off somewhere with support, and honestly, the market right now. You could get a really strong price for it." I've been running some numbers. He'd been running some numbers. I asked him if he'd been running those numbers before or after he found out I was in the hospital. He said that wasn't fair. I said a lot of things weren't fair, and we looked at each other for a moment, and then he said he had to get back. He'd check in later. He left his business card on my bedside table, which I thought was either a habit so deep he didn't notice it, or something so tone-deaf it couldn't be an accident. and then he walked out. Patricia came in about 10 minutes later to check my blood pressure. She glanced at the business card on the table but didn't say anything. "My son," I said by way of explanation. "I know," she said. "I saw him in the hallway." She asked if I needed anything. I said I could use some water and maybe a reason to believe I hadn't completely failed as a father. She brought the water. She said, "From what I can see, you seem like someone who gave a lot and got less back than you deserved. That's not failure. That's just bad luck with people." I didn't say anything, but I didn't forget it either. The third day, nobody came. I had time to think. That's the thing about hospitals that nobody tells you. It's not the pain that's the hardest part. It's the time. The hours between vitals checks and meal trays when you're just lying there with whatever's in your own head. And what was in my head was not comfortable company. I thought about the loan from 4 years ago. $65,000, which Gregory had needed to cover a gap in financing on a commercial property deal that was, he assured me, going to make us both very comfortable. I'd asked about repayment once, about a year later, and he'd gotten irritated in a way that made me not ask again. The deal had closed. He'd made money. The $65,000 had never come back. I thought about the time my wife Diane was in her final months. She passed 5 years ago, breast cancer, stage 4, diagnosed 18 months before she died. Gregory visited twice during those 18 months. He lived 20 minutes away. He visited twice. I thought about the house. It's a 4-bedroom colonial in Lyle, the same house Gregory grew up in. Diane and I bought it in 1991. I've put 30 years of weekends into that house. The deck I built myself, the kitchen we renovated, the garden Diane planted that I've kept going because letting it go felt like losing her a second time. Gregory had mentioned the house before. A comment here, a suggestion there. But lying in that hospital bed listening to him in my memory, I heard it differently. I heard the pattern of it. He'd been building towards something. On the 4th day, Patricia was off shift. But there was another nurse, an older man named Jerome, who brought my medication in the afternoon and stopped to talk for a few minutes. He'd worked that floor for almost 20 years. He'd seen a lot of families come through. "You got anyone coming today?" he asked. I said I wasn't sure. He nodded slowly. He said, "You know, I had a patient last year. Similar situation. Came in alone. Left alone. 6 months later, he came back to volunteer. Read to the cardiac patients on Thursdays. Said it was the best thing that had come out of the worst week of his life." He patted my arm. "Sometimes a hard room has a good door in it. You just have to look for it." Gregory did not come on day 4. On day 5, Patricia was back on shift. She came in the morning and said I was being discharged the following day. She went over the discharge instructions, the sling, the follow-up appointments, the restrictions on lifting and driving for the next several weeks. When she finished, she asked if I had someone to pick me up. I said I'd call my son. I called Gregory that evening. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail. I sent a text. He texted back 2 hours later. "Sorry, crazy week. Can you call a car service?" I sat with that text for a long time. Then I called my neighbor Frank, who is 72 years old and has bad knees, and still came to pick me up the next morning at 8:30 without a single word of complaint, because that is the kind of man Frank is. In the car on the way home, Frank told me about his own son, who calls every Sunday without fail from Portland. He didn't say it to make a point. He just talked, the way old men do when they're comfortable. But I heard the point anyway. I got home. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, looking at Diane's garden through the back window. The chrysanthemums were doing well. She always said chrysanthemums were stubborn in the best way. They came back even when you thought they were finished. That night, I made a decision. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive man. I didn't want to punish Gregory. What I wanted, what I had needed for years, and had been too stubborn or too hopeful to pursue, was clarity. I wanted the situation to be honest, even if the honesty was hard, because what we had been doing, Gregory and I, was not a relationship. It was a performance of one. He performed being a dutiful son when it was convenient, and I performed being satisfied with that. And somewhere in the middle, Diane's garden kept growing and my savings kept shrinking, and the house Gregory had been eyeing got more valuable every year. I called a friend of mine named Arthur the next morning. Arthur and I worked together for 15 years at the county. He's retired now too, but his son-in-law is an estate attorney in Oak Brook, and Arthur had mentioned him more than once over the years. I made an appointment. The attorney's name was Marcus Webb. He was thorough and direct, and he didn't waste my time with pleasantries. I laid out the situation. He asked good questions. At the end of the meeting, he outlined what was possible and what it would take to accomplish it. Over the next 3 weeks, moving carefully because of the ribs, driving again only after the 4th week, I did several things. I had my will revised, the house, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio I'd built carefully over 30 years. Gregory had been the sole beneficiary of all of it. I changed that. I set aside a specific sum, enough to be meaningful but far from everything, with conditions attached. The rest I directed toward Diane's college scholarship fund, which we'd established in her name at the local community college the year after she passed, and toward 2 of my nieces who had shown me over the years what it looks like when someone actually shows up. I put the house in a revocable living trust. Marcus explained that this was not unusual. Many people his age do it for estate planning reasons, to avoid probate. But it also meant that the house was no longer simply sitting there waiting to be inherited. Gregory couldn't challenge it easily. It restructured. I also sent a letter to the company where I'd co-signed a business line of credit for Gregory 3 years ago. Another request I had complied with because he was my son and I believed at the time that it was the right thing to do. I consulted with Marcus and then had my name formally removed from that agreement, which Gregory's credit and business standing now allowed. He no longer needed me on it. He just hadn't bothered to update the paperwork because there was no reason for him to want to. There was one more thing. When Gregory had visited me in the hospital, I'd noticed something. He'd set his phone face down on the table near the window while we talked, which he always did when he was in meetings, to signal he was present. But before he left, he picked it up and answered a text quickly, and the preview I caught, just a few words, was from a contact named Diane W. Not my Diane. Someone else. I didn't think much of it at the time. My mind was elsewhere, but a week after I got home, I was going through the mail and found a credit card statement that had been sent to my address by mistake. Gregory had used my address at some point and apparently never updated it. It was a card in his name only, but the billing address was mine. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't looking for anything. I just opened what came to my house. The statement showed charges I recognized: restaurants, gas, a hardware store, and some I didn't. A hotel in downtown Chicago, twice in the past 2 months. A jewelry store in Oak Brook Center in August. Gregory has been married to his wife Lynette for 9 years. They have 2 kids, my grandchildren, 8 and 11 years old. I folded the statement and put it in a folder in my filing cabinet, and I called Marcus again. I am not a vindictive man, but I am a thorough one. About 6 weeks after my discharge, Gregory called me on a Saturday morning. He opened with small talk, which told me something was up, because Gregory doesn't do small talk with me unless he wants something. He asked how the ribs were healing. He asked about the car situation, and then, with the same tone he'd used in the hospital, the rehearsed tone, he said he'd been thinking a lot about the house. He said the market in Lisle had been strong. He said he'd been talking to a colleague about senior living communities in the area. Some really nice ones, he said, and not that expensive with the proceeds from the house. He said he thought it would be the right move. He said he was thinking about my future. He was thinking about my future. He was thinking about my future. I let him finish. Then I asked him if he wanted to come over. I said there was something I needed to talk to him about as well. He came the following Thursday evening. He was in the casual version of his work clothes. Dress shirt, no tie. And he brought a bottle of wine, which he set on the counter with a flourish that was probably meant to set a collaborative tone. I had the dining room table set with the folder from my filing cabinet, some documents from Marcus's office, and 2 glasses of water. He noticed the papers immediately. His eyes moved to them and then back to me, and I watched him recalibrate. I told him to sit down. I told him I'd been thinking about the house too, and about a lot of other things, and that I wanted to be straightforward with him because I thought we were past the point where being polite was the same as being honest. I told him the house was in a trust. I told him I'd revised my will with the help of an attorney and that I was comfortable with the arrangements. I told him I'd removed my name from the business line of credit, which was purely a practical financial decision that Marcus had recommended. Gregory's face went through several versions of itself during this. He said, "Dad, I don't understand what's happening here." I said I thought he probably did. He said he'd only been trying to look out for me. I said that in 23 days, in that hospital and recovery period, he had visited once, for approximately 40 minutes, on the second day, to tell me I should sell my house. I said that Frank, my 72-year-old neighbor with bad knees, had done more for me in that period than my own son. I said I had been making excuses for his version of fatherhood for a long time, and that I was done making them, not because I was angry, but because pretending was exhausting and I was 67 years old and I didn't have the energy for it anymore. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So what, you're cutting me out?" Just like that. I said no. I said I was not cutting him out. I said there was a portion of the estate with his name on it, and that the conditions attached to it were simple, genuine contact, not transactional contact. I told him what that looked like to me. A phone call that wasn't about money. A visit that wasn't preceded by an agenda, showing up when it was inconvenient, which was the only time showing up actually meant something. I told him I didn't need a perfect son. I needed a real one. He was quiet again, longer this time. He looked at the table. He looked at the wine bottle, still unopened on the counter. He said, "Mom would have handled this differently." I said, "Your mother visited her own mother every single week for the last 3 years of her life, even when she was sick herself, even when she was exhausted, even when the drive was hard. She didn't handle things differently. She just did what love actually looks like." He didn't say anything after that for a long time. I didn't feel the silence. I've spent 38 years filling silences that Gregory should have filled himself, and I was done with that too. Eventually, he asked about the credit card statement. I told him that was a separate conversation, one that I thought he needed to have with Lynette first, and that it was not my business to make it mine. But I told him I knew, and that he should factor that into whatever he decided to do next, because it was relevant. He left about 20 minutes later. He didn't take the wine. That was 4 months ago. In those 4 months, Gregory has called me 7 times. Not about the house. Not about money. Once to tell me his older kid, my grandson Cooper, had made the travel soccer team and wanted to know if I'd come watch. I went. I stood on the sideline in the November cold and watched my grandson play soccer, and he ran over to me afterward, 11 years old and sweaty and grinning, and said, "Grandpa, did you see my goal?" And I said I saw every second of it, and I meant it. Gregory and I are not where we need to be. I won't pretend that. There's too much ground between us that didn't just appear overnight, and it won't disappear overnight either. He's dealing with his marriage, which I stay out of. He's dealing with whatever accounting he's doing of his own choices, which I cannot do for him. But he called last week just to call, talked about his week, asked about mine, mentioned he drove past the old Portillo's on Ogden, and remembered how we used to go there after his Little League games, every Friday in the summer, every single one. I'd forgotten he remembered that. I told him I remembered too. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen again, looking at the chrysanthemums. They'd gone dormant for the winter, but the beds were still tidy. I'd pruned them back in October the way Diane always did. Come spring, they'd be back. She was right about them, stubborn in the best way. I'm not telling this story because I want sympathy. I have a good life. I have Frank next door. I have my nieces. I have Cooper running across a soccer field in November, grinning. I have Patricia, who I ran into at the pharmacy 2 months ago and who told me I looked considerably better than the last time she'd seen me, which I took as high praise from someone who had seen me at my least impressive. I'm telling it because I spent a long time believing that keeping the peace was the same as having peace. That, absorbing disappointment quietly, was the same as accepting it gracefully. That being a good father meant never asking for anything back. It doesn't. It just means you're alone with very good manners. There's a difference between forgiving someone and handing them the same tools they already used to hurt you. I love my son. I will always love my son. But love without honesty is just longing. And I'm too old to spend what time I have left on longing. The house is still mine. The garden is still growing. And for the first time in a long time, when someone asks how I'm doing, I don't have to decide how much of the true answer to leave out. I've thought a lot about what it actually means to love someone well, not the feeling of it. The feeling is easy, the feeling just happens, but the doing of it, the choosing of it when it costs you something, that's the part I got wrong for a long time, and not in the way you might think. I didn't fail Gregory by loving him too much. I failed him by making love too comfortable. Every loan I gave without a real conversation about repayment, every visit I didn't push for, every silence I filled so he didn't have to. I told myself those were acts of patience. They weren't. They were acts of avoidance dressed up as grace. And the bill for that avoidance came due in a hospital room in Naperville when my own son set his business card on my bedside table and walked out. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with, honestly. The choices I made had consequences I helped create. Not his choices alone. Mine too. When you teach someone, year after year, that there are no real edges to what they can take from you, you should not be entirely surprised when they take everything they can reach. I'm not excusing what Gregory did. I'm saying I handed him the habits and then acted wounded when he used them. What changed things wasn't anger. Anger is loud, but it doesn't last, and it doesn't build anything. What changed things was clarity. Lying in that hospital bed with cracked ribs and too much time to think, I got clear about what I actually wanted and what I had been settling for, and I finally understood those were not the same thing. I wanted a son who showed up. I had been settling for a son who was present on paper and absent in every way that counted. The decisions I made after, the trust, the will, the conversations with Marcus the Thursday afternoon I put that folder on the dining room table, those weren't revenge. I want to be honest about that because it matters. They were boundaries, which is a word people use so loosely it's almost lost its meaning. But what I mean is this. I stopped organizing my life around Gregory's comfort and started organizing it around what was actually true. That's not cruelty. That's just intelligence applied late. The courage part was the dining room table. Sitting across from my son and saying the thing plainly without softening it into something he could dismiss. That took everything I had. I'd spent 38 years being the kind of father who smoothed things over, and in that room I had to be a different kind. Not hard, just honest. There's a version of strength that looks like hardness from the outside, but is actually just the refusal to keep pretending. What I know now, 4 months later, is that Gregory and I are somewhere we've never been before. It's not comfortable. It's real. He called last week just to talk. He remembered the Portillo's trips from his Little League summers. Those memories were always there. I just had to stop making it so easy for him to ignore them. You don't build a person by removing all the difficulty from their life. You build them by being honest about what you need and what you won't accept, and then holding that line with enough steadiness that they have to decide who they actually want to be. That's the work. It doesn't come naturally. It requires you to want their growth more than you want their approval. I'm still learning that. At 67. And I think that might be the point, that the learning doesn't stop. And the people willing to keep doing it are the ones who end up with something real.